Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Forgotten Hockey Players of Broadway, a nostalgic look back at our favorite Rangers from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I'm Tom Browning, along with my co-host Rob Berger. We can be heard on Google Play, iHeartRadio, YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, and of course, our website at gotommyboyproductions.libsyn.com. That's gotommyboyproductions.libsyn.com. Please check it out. You can capture all of our episodes on our webpage. You can contact us by just clicking on the contact bar. You can leave a message. We'd love to hear from you. Love to hear about the players that you would like for us to profile. Love to hear about maybe some of the seasons other than the 60s, 70s, and 80s that really made an impact on you as a fan. Again, we will be going off the menu every once in a while. We'll be talking about the current day New York Rangers, the state of the franchise, and again, we love to talk about previous playoff games, impactful trades that took place in New York Rangers history. So wherever you listen to us, please hit subscribe. It's free. So without further ado, here are your hosts, Tom Browning and Rob Berger. Thanks for tuning in and welcome to another episode of the Forgotten Hockey Players of Broadway. I'm Tom Browning, along with my host Rob Berger and my son Mike Browning. Guys, hope all is well. How you doing?
Pretty good. Pretty good.
Good. Glad to be back on.
Yeah, it's good to be back on. Here we are at the end of September, and we didn't quite time it just right, but I was hoping maybe the Stanley Cup playoffs would be finished and we can kind of, talk about the winner, but it looks like right now between the Dallas Stars and the Lightning, it didn't start off well for the Lightning. Maybe it was fatigue. They faced a rested Stars team the first game of the Stanley Cup Finals, but they have really distinguished themselves these last two games. And they look like they're in pretty good shape right now. What do you think, Rob?
Yeah, and getting Steven Stamkos back, huge. What a game changer for him. Just one of those great hockey moments, him scoring so quickly into the game. We'll see. I'm interested to see where we go from 2-1, if things even out or Tampa Bay finally brings it home.
Yeah, and Mike, you can probably touch on this. I think Stamkos might be sitting out the next game. It looks like he aggravated that lower body injury, right?
Yeah, that's what I read. So, but it's funny how dominant Tampa Bay was all season and in the playoffs. So then they still didn't have Steven Stamkos, and they just added him to their fourth line. Just incredible. Just an embarrassment of riches.
Yeah. Well, they've always had that, and that really hasn't done the trick for them. Maybe John Cooper finally wins his first Stanley Cup as head coach. I guess you can't count the Stars out. So it should be interesting if the Lightning can close the deal this time.
All they had to do was get rid of that half the former Rangers they had. Set up their odds a little bit.
I know. It's funny, isn't it? It's we all thought that when they made that trade, some of the longtime Rangers would finally be in a position to win the Cup. Although McDonough is still involved, right? I mean, McDonough still has a chance.
Yeah, McDonough's still there, but I think they got rid of Girardi, JT Miller, Strawman,
Callahan.
It's just incredible how many Boyle. It was incredible how many former Rangers they had on that team at one time. Yeah,
that's very, very true. When we made our selections, I think, Rob, you and I selected, Mike and I selected Las Vegas, and you would pick the Flyers, I believe, right, Rob, for your Stanley Cup champion?
Yeah, that is correct. So, as usual, I'm just stellar with predictions.
Well, that makes the three of us.
Well, Vegas just, they don't score. I mean, they somehow dominate games, just completely outright dominate games. They just can't bury the puck. It's incredible. Yeah. Every single visual advanced stat metric just points to them dominating the games, and then the actual goals just don't stack up. It's very strange.
That was surprising. I really was surprised at how inept they looked.
A lot of teams, Colorado too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think they looked inept. That team is a heavy, fast, skilled, four-line, good goaltending, just built for the playoffs team, and they outskate you, they outhit you, they outpass you, and it was evident. But they just couldn't bury the puck. It was, and this isn't the first time. It's their cup runs in the past have been the same way. Every single thing that points to success was there, except for the actual final result. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I think that you mentioned all the ingredients, Mike, for a cup championship. You mentioned the hitting. That's so important. I think the Islanders really demonstrated that. They really embraced GM Lou Lamoriello and the coaches MO, Barry Trotz. That's the way they play. They're built for the playoffs, and hopefully the Rangers can learn from that. I hope Gorton, who should be familiar with that since he was the former GM of the Bruins, and the Bruins have always had that in their culture. I hope he and Quinn, I hope they embody that whole philosophy going forward. I hope they surround these young, talented kids with some, heavy, skilled players that can bring some leadership and lend some character to a playoff-built team. I think that's what was missing. Besides Reeves, I think Vegas was missing that ingredient the last couple of years. I think there were some lessons from these playoffs that can be learned, that the Rangers can learn from. But just to end this part of the podcast, do you guys think the Lightning will seal the deal? What are your thoughts, real quick?
Don't ask me. No, I would just say, yeah. I mean, I think Tampa, they're the best team. I think they may have been the best team on paper coming in, and they're playing like it.
Yeah.
So go play.
I think this is finally their time.
I think so.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. So we'll see how it goes. And
you missed the biggest news coming up. Your boy Henrik Lundqvist looks like his time is over in New York.
Well, that's kind of old news, though, right?
Yeah, but the buyout window is actually open, so it's actually coming to fruition, it seems. So yeah. I would assume. It hasn't been stated directly, but I would assume there would be some kind of press conference called shortly. I doubt they're going to wait for the second buyout window on this, and they're probably just going to get it done quickly. I do think it's the wrong move. I think buying out his contract's the wrong move, but it seems that that's the direction they're going in. I think Larry Brooks has corroborated that at some point. Not that he's ever right, but it seems like that's what's going to happen. So it's truly an end of an era in New York.
Well, I thought I read Brooksy the other day saying that the Rangers just may wait for the second window because there may be some teams that would make an offer maybe to be in play for a trade with the Rangers. And if, the buyout would be their insurance policy if no one took a nibble on Lundqvist, but that there still may be, by waiting for a second buyout opportunity, a second window, that there might be a team that might want to strike a deal with the Rangers, or am I misreading that?
Well, that would be more intelligent on the Rangers' part. I think buying out Henrik Lundqvist should be the last resort, and I don't think it should be a resort at all, because why would they have to do that? He's got 1 year left on his contract. I think they can comfortably fit everybody under the cap going forward if they trade one of Strome and D'Angelo, which I believe they were trying to do anyway. Putting more dead cap on your salary cap on your payroll is never smart, and it seems like that's what they're trying to do. So I would assume that they are looking for other options, of whether a trade or something like that. But unless Henrik Lundqvist flat out wouldn't show up, I don't know what the big deal is with having him as your backup goalie again for the.
No, they're not going to do that. You talk about that would be the personification of an albatross. First of all, he doesn't want to be the third string goalie, and there's no way they're going to keep Lundqvist over Georgiev and Shesterkin. They're not going to do that. They're going to keep the kids. That would be a humongous. Can you imagine Henrik Lundqvist, who doesn't think twice about throwing his defenseman under the bus whenever he gets grouchy? I can't see him in civvies for 3/4 of the season, not even dressing. That would be a humongous locker room negative if they did that, Mike. I'm sorry. I'm kind of surprised you would even bring that up. Knowing him the way you do and his ego and everything else, how that would be an untenable situation for the Rangers. Rob, what are your thoughts?
He's making $8 million, so it's not too bad of a deal. He's still playing hockey. He's making $8 million. It would be a comfortable existence, playing, only half the games that he would normally play, getting some time in the press box. But he would still be part of the team. He'd still be getting ice time, and he'd be making a nice salary doing it. So, it's the smart thing for the Rangers, by the way.
I think it depends on what this season or whatever. What month is this? Whenever 2020, 21, what the Rangers' plan is. If they're going to be competitive, I think having the two young goalies as your only goalies is a mistake. And also, the question is, how much is Georgiev going to ask for? And do you give him one of the, an extension contract where you give him 1 or 2 years until he becomes a UFA? Or do you wrap him up long-term now? Having these two 24-year-old goaltenders going into next season, I don't know if that's a smart move. I mean, think about it. You could probably get a lot for Georgiev right now going into his RFA year.
Go ahead, Mike.
I was going to say the Rangers are never bashful about giving their restricted free agents bridge deals. So I assume that's whatever the case, whatever happens with Lundqvist, that's what they're going to do with Georgiev anyway.
They have 5 RFAs.
Right. So I would say that if they are intent on keeping Strome and DeAngelo, then buying out Lundqvist might be your only option. But I think, as we talked about before, trading Strome is probably a good idea anyway, and the market for DeAngelo is probably worth testing too. So anyway, my point is I don't know if buying out Henrik Lundqvist is a good idea in general, especially buying him out in the first buyout window without really kind of testing your other options. But it seems like what I'm seeing that it's actually going to happen, and it seems like he will be bought out in the first window, which is just very weird.
Yeah, it's weird. I know. I mean, why have that on the books?
Right.
Yeah, I think we all agree that we shouldn't do it on the first buyout. Where we differ is on the second. I do believe that if they can't make a deal with some other team for a trade, then they should definitely do it on the second go around. But we will see. We'll see how it goes. On another note, a sad note, the captain that I grew up with as a youngster, Bob Nevin, passed away this week. And Mike, Rob, I don't know if you remember, but Nevin was the very first show I did on my podcast. A very, very classy, productive player for the New York Rangers. I was very, very sad and very disappointed that there was such lack of news in the press about the passing of Bob Nevin, especially from guys like Larry Brooks, who always touts how he was a balcony season ticket holder for the Rangers, when they played in the old Garden before they transitioned to the new Madison Square Garden back in the late 60s. And he didn't mention a freaking word about Bob Nevin in any article this week. And I was just really dismayed to see that. And even the Rangers, they sent a nice condolence to the Nevin family, but there was very little in the New York press. I didn't see anything in the New York press about Bob Nevin. And it's amazing. The guy played 7 years back in the late 60s, mid-60s, early 70s for the club. He was brought in by Emil Francis to really bring that winning pedigree to the team. He had won 2 Stanley Cups out of 3 years with the Toronto Maple Leafs. He finished second in the Rookie of the Year voting with his teammate, Davey Keon, who went on to be a Hall of Fame player with the Toronto Maple Leafs. And that Maple Leaf club was loaded. And, it was Emil Francis that brought Stemkowski and Bob Nevin, albeit in different times in the 60s, early 70s, to the Rangers to really help lead that young team of Vic Hatfield and Rod Gilbert and Jean Rattel and Brad Park to really bring that winning attitude and leadership to the club. And he just did a phenomenal job and had 7 great years with the team. Captain of the club, always classy, always professional. The most vivid memory I have about Bob Nevin was 1971 playoffs against the Toronto Maple Leafs. In game number 6, the Maple Leaf team was loaded at that time. The Rangers had a chance to really win a playoff round for the first time in really a long time. It was really the culmination of bringing all these kids, having them gel. It was in game 6 in the 1971 playoffs where Bob Nevin scored both goals and the overtime winner in game 6 at Toronto to oust the great Toronto Maple Leaf club, and sent the Rangers on to the next round against the Chicago Blackhawks. But I'll never forget watching that game on a Saturday evening on Channel 9, and he scoring the first goal early in the game for the Rangers and then winning it in overtime, breaking a 1-1 tie on a 2-on-1 with Vic Hatfield, beating Jacques Plante, the great Jacques Plante, for the overtime winner. That was probably the greatest overtime goal at that time for the new generation, my generation of Ranger fans, because the Rangers really had a tough time of it in the 50s and early 60s. This was really the coming out party for the New York Rangers, where they were really an incredibly popular team, selling out Madison Square Garden, one of the loudest arenas in the league during that time. I was just really chagrined not to see anything mentioned about his passing, especially in such an important time in Rangers history. And I guess goes to show that the Ranger fan has evolved over the years. Very few people of my generation maybe even follow the team anymore. Not sure of the reason for that. And I guess the millennials just don't have a sense of history or really embrace the history of the club, for whatever reason. So I don't know, guys, what are your thoughts?
Well, that's what this show's for.
Well, yeah. I mean, he was.
Well, there you go.
Exactly
there you
right.
go. But it's for the younger people or the people that may have forgotten. It's this guy went away for a long time. I think it's not like he was involved in the organization much, like some of the other former Rangers. And there's a lot going on in the world right now, and you don't typically and B, you don't typically have the Stanley Cup around this time. So. So
I think
you have the Stanley Cup Finals, the NBA semifinals, the Major League Baseball. They're pushing the playoffs. You have the beginning of the football season. You have the college football season going on. It's just it gets easy to get lost in the shuffle.
Yeah, well, I guess that's
we can't say it enough. MSG, they need to put on old games, and they need to put on games that didn't happen just in 1994, or a game
right.
from 2014.
Right.
They have the tapes. I mean, you could say the same for Islanders too. We could show more than 1980 through 1983. There happen to be other seasons of these teams, and even if it's at 1:00 in the afternoon, obviously I do not know anything about TV production. I'm not claiming I do, but it would be nice to see it every once in a while. Some old Ranger stuff on there for us.
Rob,
to
you're
watch.
so right. But you know what? For some reason, the New York Rangers are one of the few teams in the New York sports ecosystem, if you will, or even the National Hockey League, that for some reason have lost all their games from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. As a matter of fact, there used to be a show on MSG that Al Troutwig hosted called The Vault, MSG Vault, and they admit that they have lost all their games, and they actually asked for fans if they had any video that they took from their own television set to please send them in. And the Rangers don't have anything, virtually nothing from the 60s, 70s. It's a shame. It really is a shame because they didn't capture their history on television. And a lot of their tapes come from the visiting team. A lot of the stuff that you will see come from either the Flyers or the Bruins or Montreal. As a matter of fact, Bob Nevin's overtime goal, you can see a snippet of it, courtesy of the Toronto Maple Leafs television network. So, yeah, you're right, Rob. They should. They just don't have it. And I just don't, for the life of me, I can't figure out why. But that's really kind of the bottom line on it. Anyway, I think your points are well taken. I think that those could be contributing to a reason why he wasn't mentioned much. Anyway, he was an important player in my lifetime. If I can figure it out, I think I'm going to add a bonus to this show, and I'll replay the Bob Nevin, my very first podcast. I'll attach it to this show for the fans to listen to if I can figure it out through the editing process. So we'll see how that goes. Any final thoughts on Nevin before we get to our featured player, Tom Laidlaw?
Not here. He did lead the 1975 Kings in goals.
He did. He had his best
which
offense.
is a nice transition as we talk about Rangers that became Kings.
Yep.
That's right.
Yep. He did have his best, finest offensive season with the LA Kings. And it's funny, the Rangers and Kings, a lot of former Kings wound up playing for the Rangers. A lot of former Rangers wound up playing for the Kings at the end of their career. So it's very similar, as did Tom Laidlaw, as we'll talk about right now. So let's get into Laidlaw. So the featured player for us this week is number 2, Tom Laidlaw. You guys have heard me say it before. He was really Dan Girardi before Dan Girardi. He was the Rangers' Dan Girardi, a stay-at-home defensive defenseman drafted by the Rangers in the 6th round during the 1978 amateur draft. Came right out of Northern Michigan University. Only played one game with the New Haven Nighthawks, so he kind of graduated from college, played a single game in minor leagues, and then went up to the big club to start his career during the 1980-81 season. Any opening thought regarding Tom Laidlaw? Rob, we'll go with you.
I come from a different perspective growing up in Los Angeles, so we know Tom Laidlaw well, especially for the reasons of who the Kings traded away to get Tom Laidlaw.
Oh, yeah, Dion.
Which, at the time, and even, outside of Luc Robitaille, Gretzky is probably the greatest King of all time. I mean, we'll say judgment for the 2010s. players in those teams. But yeah, one of the most durable hockey players for that short period of time until he started getting banged up. Also remarkable to have a guy play every game in the season and not score a goal.
Right. Yep, he did that in 82, 83 with the Rangers, and no goals and 10 assists. As Larry Melnick would say, he couldn't break a pane of glass with his slap shot. I mean, he really did not have a very hard shot. He really was a defensive defenseman, defense first. As a matter of fact, when he first came up, he was a very good fighter, by the way, too. He had, I think he said in his career, he had about 20, 25 fights. And you catch a few of them on YouTube. But he was very typical of the Rangers. He would never initiate fights like a Marty McSorley or a lot of the Flyers or Bobby Nystrom or Gillies or players like that. He would always, he would react to one and defend himself very well, but he was never one to really initiate intimidation. But he was a hard-nosed player, very physical, very strong. And, he grew up on a farm. He grew up on a farm in Western Canada. It was a dairy farm that was run by his grandfather and his father. And that's where he learned a lot of the skill sets that he's now preaching today through his website, truegritlife.com, which is really a self-help type of website where he really talks about mental, physical, and spiritual discipline. Very impressive. He brought that same attitude to the rink as he did on the farm growing up. And now he's kind of teaching it as a guest speaker, public speaker, corporate speaker. He's got the website. Very impressive guy, very intelligent. He was known for his playing practical jokes on players in the locker room. He was a very jovial type of guy, but he was known like Eli Manning was known for his pranks in the locker room. Laidlaw was really that type of player, but he was no nonsense on the ice, very dependable. And it was Herb Brooks who kind of reined him in early 80s. He said, Tommy, you're too valuable not to be in the penalty box. Keep the fighting to an absolute minimum. I want you on the ice. And that's, when he said that he tried to really hold off on going after players. But no, he was very, very disciplined, good shot blocker. The goaltenders loved him because he had great position. He was very disciplined as a defenseman. Although John Davidson always tells the story about how Laidlaw scored his very first NHL goal against his own goalie, Davidson. And, that he doesn't live that down. But, he was just a good, solid player, wore number 2 like Brad Park, and played, I think it was 7 years with the Rangers, and then he played, was it 5, Rob, with the LA Kings?
Yeah, about.
Yeah.
I think 5 years.
4 years with the Kings.
4 years with the Kings.
And he played with some great Kings teams, with Luc Robitaille and Wayne Gretzky, and he speaks very fondly of his time in L.A. as well, although he was very hurt by the trade. Although he says, I was traded for Marcel Dion, so, how hurt could I be? Yeah, he was very, he was a good player, a good, solid player for both of those organizations. And he's still very much, involved with the New York Rangers alumni. I just saw, I think, a podcast from a few days ago where he had Dave Maloney, Ron Greshner, and Larry Melnick on, and it's hilarious. It's on YouTube. You should look at it. It's some good stories about the Western Hockey League, the minor leagues, and all the stuff that went on, all the fights. The game starting at 8:00, and then the brawls stopping at 2:00 in the morning, and then having to get up the next day for a 1:00 game. So it was, you guys should tune it in. It's a lot of fun, but. Yeah, that's kind of my recollection of Laidlaw. Mike, what are your thoughts?
I definitely see the similarities with Dan Girardi, and it seemed like he came in and filled that same niche, and which was a vital one for the Rangers, at least in Girardi's case, over several years, and could probably why he didn't spend too much time in the AHL. They saw the role that he could play, and they plugged him in immediately, and then he was just on the blue line. For the rest of the time before he was traded for Marcel Dion, and I wonder if that's what really got his kind of showbiz career going, getting traded to LA. I wonder if that's where his kind of post hockey legacy started. But one correction is he's from Brampton, so he's actually from Eastern Canada, not Western Canada. But that's another similarity with Girardi. They're both from Ontario. But there's plenty of farmland. There's plenty of farmland in Eastern Canada too. So. The farm boy narrative fits for it's not just Western Canada.
And I think one of the reasons why he didn't play much in the American Hockey League could have been, Herb Brooks obviously had a penchant for college players. Brooksy came from the college ranks, and obviously he brought a lot of his United States national team to the Rangers when he became coach of the Rangers. And it might have been the fact that he saw that, Laidlaw had experience with the Northern Michigan University, and maybe that has something to do with not playing that many games in the minor leagues.
Yeah. It's always interesting seeing Canadian kids, especially Canadian kids from Ontario, hop over to the NCAA, especially then when it wasn't as big as it is now. I mean, that team, I took a quick look. Obviously, I didn't know ahead of time who was on that team, but there were a few guys that made the NHL from those teams, like Don Waddell and Steve Weeks. Terry Hawk, guys, actually a couple guys that also played on the Kings. Of course, that Rangers Kings connection is pretty funny. But yeah, that's a great point about Herb Brooks and guys playing, especially that brand of NCAA hockey, which was, then and now different from Northeast hockey.
Yeah, you see it more often now. And I noticed the same thing. I was going to ask you about it. You see, I think Jonathan Toews is a guy who did not play in the CHL. He went to the NCAA. Some other guys have done it too, some superstar level guys. But I feel like back then that was just, if you were a Canadian guy, especially as Rob said in the OHL or from Ontario, where there's a highest concentration of CHL teams, probably. Per mile in the OHL than any other part of Canada, then your chances of making the NHL back then probably weren't too high. So it is interesting that the Ontario guy went to the NCAA and then made it to the NHL fairly smoothly without any only one game in between. So I wonder if that maybe was the beginning of that Canada to the NCAA pipeline, or at least the Northern Michigan University was a kind of a innovator there, getting guys from Canada or being able to recruit guys from Canada.
To be fair, he was playing in the Upper Peninsula in Michigan, so he may have even been. He was probably in reality he's actually I think 3 hours north of Toronto. How far?
Yeah,
he was
yeah,
playing.
True.
But still, point taken that to see guys in the NCAA from Canada.
I wonder if defensive defensemen, they don't have that many moving parts to their game, right? And I wonder if that's easier for them to assimilate into the NHL game as long as they're good at what they do, and maybe they're more apt to jump right in and find a niche and play to their capabilities, and maybe an offensive defenseman or someone that doesn't, or actually for defensemen don't have the same skill set. I don't know if that makes sense or if that has anything to do with it. I suspect that Herb Brooks probably had a lot to do with that. And not to mention that, he was probably a very effective defensive defenseman at Northern Michigan University, and he was drafted in the 6th round. No, he was a good player. And again, I had season tickets for the Rangers at that time, and he didn't stand out in any way, shape, or form. He was there for his teammates. He was tough, physical, strong, very strong. And that kind of leads me to my next point. Right now, Tom Laidlaw, and like you said, Rob, you alluded to the images of him on the internet. He says right now at 60 years old, he's in the best shape he's ever been. He's strong as an ox. He gets up at 3:30 every morning. He does his march from 3:30 to 5. He goes to the gym at 5 o'clock and hits the weights every single day. He is just an incredibly disciplined guy in every inch of his life. It's very motivating for a guy like myself. I'll be turning 65 soon, and I really believe in eating clean. I really believe in exercise. I was very pleased to see, because you see a lot of guys who played hockey, and they kind of let themselves go, especially the guys who played in the 60s, 70s, maybe even the 80s. And Tom Laidlaw really is the epitome of the new age athlete who really embraces the emotional, spiritual, physical, mental part of life. And I'm really going to get into his True Grit Life website. I'm going to really try to pick up a lot of stuff. He, like you said, Mike, he was on Survivor. I didn't see any of the episodes. Rob, Mike, did you guys see any of it? And I know he was the first Canadian to take part in the Survivor series.
Well, it's funny. I take a poll of New Yorkers. Who knows Tom Laidlaw more from Survivor or for playing hockey?
Yeah, yeah. Great one.
Yeah. No, I don't watch the show, but it's like that's one of the first things that come up when you Google him, and that's what I said. I wonder if it was all spurred by his trade to LA, and he got exposure to kind of the show business and that kind of lifestyle and the healthy lifestyle from LA, and that kind of set him on that course for his post hockey career. But it's funny. I've heard of him as a player, and he's kind of made a name for himself more outside of hockey than in hockey since he retired.
Both as an agent and as a public speaker. I know that he, I think for 10 years or so, he was a part of a Jim Rome podcast, or maybe it was a radio show out in the West Coast. Obviously, Jim Rome is very big, not only nationally, but especially out in the West Coast. Matter of fact, I listened to part of their podcast from, I think it was last September. It was a very entertaining one, over 50 minutes long, and the two are very close, obviously, when you listen to it. Yeah, I guess they were partners themselves in a sports talk show. So that's something else that the fans can tune into on YouTube if they so desire. Anything else that stands out, Rob, from a Kings perspective? I know that he assisted on Gretzky's point streak that surpassed Gordie Howe for the most points in the history of the National Hockey League. I think he set up a goal with Bernie Nichols, I believe.
Yeah, I believe that was in Edmonton.
Was that in Edmonton? Yeah.
I believe so, yeah. Laidlaw special memories a lot of Kings fans because of the teams that he was on, specifically the 89 team and the 90 team, which were really the first competitive team. Those are Gretzky's first teams, and after they finished last in the Smythe his first year, but then they came off and knocked off the defending Cup champs 2 years in a row in the first round. So those teams, so he's always, he'll always be a member of those teams. He didn't get to play in the postseason on the 90 team, but he did in 89. So yeah, from a Kings perspective, everybody knows Tom Laidlaw. Well, at least I hope so. Just to go back to the conversation we had at the beginning about Bob Nevin, I hope people remember those teams with the unsung heroes of those teams, your Kudelskis and Kruzhelniskis and whatnot.
Yeah, I was gonna say from a Rangers fan perspective, it seems like obviously he was before my time. He wasn't one of the more noteworthy players in Rangers history, but he seems like a guy that was a fan favorite. He was charismatic, and one of those guys that you have fond memories about, even though they weren't focal points of the team. So I was going to ask if you had any, back in those days from watching him, if you had any memories of him and that stand out, that maybe something that he did on the ice. I know he was in a lot of fights. He was seemed like kind of a goofy, charismatic guy. I don't know if anything stood out to you.
No, again, he was just very solid, just very steady. He played on the team with the Smurfs, Herb Brooks, where the Rangers really overachieved and they upset, I think we did a podcast on this, at least I did earlier in my podcast days with the Smurfs, really 2 years in the playoffs where the Rangers upset the Philadelphia Flyers, where the Flyers, I think, led the league 1 year in points and then finished, I think, second in the other year. And the Rangers just absolutely obliterated the Flyers because they were so quick, so shifty, so disciplined. They were so good on the power play that, he was a member along with Barry Beck on those teams. And, those were the big, strong guys on the Rangers along with Fatiou. Yeah, again, he wasn't the kind of guy that initiated any sort of dirty play or anything else. He was just, he went to again, most of his fights were, as a way of defending his teammates, defending the honor of the New York Rangers. He didn't go out and initiate stuff. He was just very steady. And as you can see with his offensive output, he only scored 20 goals with the Rangers in 7 years. And even his penalty minutes, I think his first 2 years he had over 100 minutes in penalties, and most of those were probably major penalties. They weren't minor. So he's a clean player. He didn't take the undisciplined penalty. He was just a clean player, hard-nosed, a goalie's best friend type of, Davidson loved him, the Ranger goaltenders, Glenn Hanlon, all the guys that played with Laidlaw really, really enjoyed having him in front of the net. But there wasn't any one thing that I can think of that stood out that really said, I remember that Tom Laidlaw moment. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but he is recognized as the 87th all-time Ranger which I was kind of surprised to see. Of all the Ranger players played, dressed up in the red, white, and blue jersey of the Rangers, I'm surprised that he is high as he is. I think a lot of that has to do with the nuance, the game that he brought to the ice every night.
Where did we say Mike Gardner was on that list? Where was Mike Gardner on that list? Wasn't he like?
He might have been. Yeah, we did. I forget what it was. I'll have to go check that out. Gardner might have been. So a guy who had 1 or 2 goals a season, and a guy who had 45 goals a season are on the same in the same location on that list, huh?
It's a great example of what memory does to us, though, right? I mean, people are revered. You tend to look back on guys being better than they were. I think that happens when I do this a lot. I'll get down the wormhole just looking at older and older players and think, oh, really? That guy only scored 10 goals that year? Or I remember him being so much better.
It goes the other way, too. Sometimes you were like, oh, man. Like you look at a role player on a team and you realize that player was actually a star. They were just overshadowed by other guys. And when that guy departs, or the team isn't as good, or that guy goes somewhere else and becomes great, and so it's that kind of bias, that historical bias that seeps in when you evaluate players from the past. It's interesting to take another look back at them.
Yeah, I mean, you can speak to Harry Howell and Andy Bathgate, right? Andy Bathgate was the star Ranger forward, Hall of Famer that was traded for Bob Nevin to Toronto. And then Harry Howell, who was probably at the time the Rangers' greatest defenseman in their history before Brad Park. And we haven't done a show on either of those two guys yet. You're looking at the late 50s, early 60s. And I bet you if you go to a Ranger fan today and ask them if they knew who Andy Bathgate was or Harry Howell, even though their uniform hangs up in the rafters, I wouldn't be surprised if at least half of those folks wouldn't know who they were. So, that could be a show too. Both of those guys are deserving of a show, both Bathgate and Howell. Although I don't have any recollection of really either of those two gentlemen, playing for the Rangers. But yeah, there's a lot of other guys that we can touch on. I was drawing a list the other day, and I'll end this real quick because I know, Rob, you have to get off. But, you got Reijo Ruotsalainen, James Patrick, Jan Eriksson, Eddie Johnstone, Kelly Kissio, Carol Vadnais, Brian Mullen, Ulf Dahlen, Darren Turcotte, Rod Sealing, Jimmy the Chief Nielsen. There's a lot of guys that we have yet to scratch the surface on that really, Billy Fairburn from the Kachuk, Fairburn, Vickers line. There's a lot of guys that we can talk about going forward that really deserve mention as a forgotten New York Ranger. So any closing thoughts, guys? Rob, any closing thoughts on Laidlaw?
No closing time. It's the end of September, and I'm about to watch some Stanley Cup Finals.
So weird.
Let us know how let us know how the Laidlaw motivational speaking and dieting and all that stuff what you find, and we'll cover it next time.
Absolutely. Maybe I'll send you guys a link to it because I'm really, Mike, I'm really big into that stuff. I really enjoy that. Yeah. Any final thoughts, Mike, on your end?
No, I think, it just goes to show that, it's fun to look back on guys and see what their role was, even if they were understated, and, to take a second look with hindsight on your side and just kind of reevaluate and kind of enjoy those guys again. And I'm sure I'll be doing that in a few years with, guys from the Rangers Stanley Cup runs, the recent ones, like, the Dan Girardis of the world and those guys. So for sure, it's always good to do this.
Absolutely. Hopefully you'll be Stanley Cup champion, New York Rangers. Some of the guys that played in the, 2021-22 Stanley Cup champion New York Rangers. That would be great. Well, Rob, thanks. Mike, thank you so much, guys, for another great show. Fans, thanks for tuning in. If I can handle it, if I can make it happen, I will attach a replay of my very first podcast about Bob Nevin. Again, thanks for tuning in. This is Tom Browning on behalf of Rob Berger and Mike Browning for the Forgotten Hockey Players of Broadway. For pressing play on this episode of the Forgotten Hockey Players of Broadway, a nostalgic look back at my favorite Rangers from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I'm your host, Tom Browning. Thanks for listening. Good afternoon, and welcome to another edition of the Forgotten Hockey Players of Broadway. Tom here. Today I would like to talk about one of my favorite all-time New York Rangers, and that is the captain, number 8, Bob Nevin. I started following the Rangers probably back during the 63, 64, 65 seasons when the team was in the midst of an incredible struggle to make the playoffs. It was really the worst of times for New York Ranger fans back in the late 50s, early 60s. It was an organization that had lost their way, an organization that found it very difficult to put wins together, and of course, leading to the inability to make the playoffs. And it wasn't until the 66-67 season, which is now kind of coined as the rise of the new New York Rangers, when they became a hockey powerhouse. But back in 64, the Ranger management really needed to find players that had a winning pedigree, that had championship caliber, that had proven themselves in the big games. And one of the things the Rangers did was they traded one of their fan favorites and Hall of Famers, Andy Bathgate, along with Don McKinney, to the Toronto Maple Leafs for Bob Nevin. Bob Nevin wore number 8 with the New York Rangers. He played 7 seasons with the New York Rangers, which was longer than he played with any other club in the National Hockey League. He had stints, again, starting off with the Leafs and then traded to the Rangers. And then he finished his career with the Minnesota North Stars and the Los Angeles Kings, where it was with the Kings that he had his most productive offensive seasons to finish his career. But it was really the beginning of his career, his first several seasons with the Leafs, and then his 7 years, 5 of which captain of the New York Rangers, where Bob Nevin really made a name for himself in the National Hockey League. It was back in the 1961 season where Bob Nevin finished second in the Calder Trophy balloting, which, of course, as you folks well know, is the Rookie of the Year award. He actually finished second to his teammate and future Hall of Famer, Davey Keon. And Davey Keon was a tremendous hockey player in his own right. But along with Davey Keon and Frank Mahovlich and some other great players with the Toronto Maple Leafs, Bob Nevin led the Maple Leafs to 2 consecutive Stanley Cups in 1962 and 1963. So Bob Nevin had that winning pedigree, that championship caliber resume that the Rangers were so desperate in need of back in the mid-60s. And it was in 1964, as I mentioned, that they traded for Bob Nevin, giving up Hall of Famer and fan favorite Andy Bathgate along with Don McKinney. And it was 2 years on the New York Rangers really shaping the clubhouse, helping the youngsters on the club to learn about what it takes to win in the National Hockey League. And Bob Nevin earned the position of captain in 1966 during the 1966-67 season. And that also happened to be the first season that the Rangers made the playoffs in many, many a year. And again, that was his first season as captain of the New York Rangers. And again, this was where the rise of the Rangers really came into play. This was the year that started the Rangers in their quest to become a powerhouse organization within the NHL. And they became that. They became a powerhouse, consistent, perennial Stanley starting in 1966-67. But it culminated in a Stanley Cup final against the Boston Bruins in 1972. But again, it was the great Bob Nevin, number 8, that really brought that winning attitude to the Rangers, starting in 64, but culminating in a winning season in 66-67 and making the playoffs for the very first time. They did lose to the Montreal Canadiens in 4 games, losing the 4th game at Madison Square Garden in overtime. And again, Ranger fans remember, and I remember listening to Marv Albert on radio vividly and hearing as he was streaking down the left wing, Red Berenson, who at the time was called Gordy Berenson by Ranger fans, hitting the post, and then John Ferguson coming down moments later and in the scramble in front, beating Eddie Giacomin to eliminate the Rangers from the Stanley Cup playoffs in the opening round in 1966-67. But Bob Nevin really was the first captain for the New York Rangers, starting the winning tradition for the New York Rangers back in the late 60s and into early 70s. Bob Nevin had 307 goals in his career, 419 assists for 726 points. As I mentioned, he finished second to his teammate Davey Keon for Rookie of the Year in 1961. But his probably a biggest moment with the Rangers, and I again remember this vividly, watching it on Channel 9, was when the Rangers eliminated the Toronto Maple Leafs during the 71-72 playoffs. I checked that, make that the 70-71 playoffs. And Bob Nevin, Game 6 in Toronto, scoring the overtime goal, catapulting the Rangers to the second round of the playoffs against the Chicago Blackhawks. And I'll never forget that game. It was a harrowing game. It was Game 6. And Toronto, just prior to that rush up ice where Nevin scored, was putting all sorts of pressure on Eddie Giacomin. They had a sustained bit of pressure, peppering Eddie Giacomin with potentially could have been the game-winning goal for the Toronto Maple Leafs. But the Rangers cleared the zone, and I have a vivid recollection of Bob Nevin going down the right side from the right faceoff circle, putting the puck in the net, and advancing the Rangers to the second round of the playoffs during the 70-71 season. It was a great game. It was really a watershed moment for the Rangers, proving that they could win a playoff game on the road in overtime against one of the top powerhouses in the National Hockey League, the Toronto Maple Leafs. Unfortunately, the Rangers, looking for a power play specialist back in 71-72, made a trade with the Minnesota North Stars to acquire Bobby Russo. And Bobby Russo, for you Ranger fans, was really a power play specialist. And he went on to do some very, very important things for the Rangers during the 72 playoffs, leading to a Stanley Cup final loss to the Boston Bruins. But it was an important trade for the Rangers. They got a very good player in Bobby Russo, who had some very good years with the Montreal Canadiens early in his career. And who knows, we might do a show on Bobby Russo later on in the year. But Bob Nevin was an important captain for the New York Rangers. He really started the winning tradition with the New York Rangers. From the Minnesota North Stars, Bob Nevin finished his career in the NHL with the LA Kings, where he actually had his finest offensive seasons. He scored over 70 points in 75-76, and he again brought that same leadership to the LA Kings in the middle 70s. He actually went on to take on an opportunity with the fledgling World Hockey Association with the Edmonton Oilers. Didn't play much, and he finished his career in the WHA with the Edmonton Oilers. So that wraps up the first installment of The Forgotten Hockey Players of Broadway, focusing on number 8, Bob Nevin. Thank you for listening. This has been a Go Tommy Boy production.